And I'm going to need, yeah, all right, that's still going good. All right. There we go.
You want me to kick it off, Gary?
Yeah, go ahead.
If you got anything you want to say first.
What I'll say is I'm really glad. I'll say to everyone, I was busy fiddling with some controls here. Really glad that Bishop Epting has agreed to do this. His expertise and experience is invaluable for us, and I know that Good Shepherd has had some experience in the past talking about other religions and things like that. And has done some visitations and things like that. But here we get to think about it from a slightly different perspective. And that's how do we engage, rather than just learning about them, how do we engage with folks who think religiously differently than we do? And so that's going to be kind of the focus of our next 5 weeks. So yes, Bishop, take it away.
Okay, thanks. As Gary and I kicked around how we might approach this class, we thought it might make some sense for him to give an overview of each of the religion's concepts, and I would share something of my experience with them or how the Episcopal Church has interacted with them in different ways, perhaps even what we, or at least I, have learned from each of them over the years. My role in ecumenical and interfaith relations was not so much to be a scholar of the world's religions, but to oversee and coordinate our work in these areas. Bishops are pastors of systems, the presiding bishop used to say, and my role was to engage the systems and the organizations and the various institutions which could leverage our participation as a fairly small church in the world of ecumenism and interfaith. So how did I get into this work? In 2001, the then presiding bishop, Frank Griswold, asked me to join his staff as his deputy for ecumenical and interfaith relations. I flew from Iowa to New York City to interview with him at the Episcopal Church Center, which is at 815 2nd Avenue, on the east side of New York, Manhattan. Frank knew something of my work in ecumenical relations, which is the relationship between the various Christian denominations or communions, while I was Bishop of Iowa. But he made it clear that he wanted more attention to be given to interfaith relations, the relationship between the world's great religions. He said something like, you know, Chris, I think we've probably gone about as far as we can go with our full communion relationship with other Christians. But the future is interfaith dialogue. We've got to understand one another if there's ever to be peace in this world. I thought immediately of the Roman Catholic scholar Hans Kuhn, who famously wrote, "There will be no peace in the world unless there is peace among the world's religions. There will never be peace among the world's religions until there is serious dialogue between the world's religions. And there will never be dialogue between the world's religions without an understanding of the foundations of each religion." I was in that same building in New York City less than a year later when those two jets smashed into the World Trade Center and ironically catapulted us into interfaith dialogue and work, especially with Muslims. But more about that when we take up Islam in a couple of weeks. I've often said that I thought I knew something about ecumenism until I became the ecumenical officer. There is so much to learn, and that is triply true when we turn our attention to the religions of the world. Of course, it's important to remind ourselves that the goal of the ecumenical movement and the goal of interfaith relations are not the same. The goal of ecumenism, as the World Council of Churches has always said, is full visible unity. That is, one church again, as we were for 1,000 years before the Great Schism, which tore apart East and West in 1054. The goal of interfaith relations is not to create one world religion. That is sometimes something of which interfaith people are accused of doing, trying to create one bland mixture of all the world's religions. The goal of interfaith is to understand one another, to respect one another, to cooperate where we can for the well-being of the world and the flourishing of humankind. Very much in line with that Hans Kuhn quote that I quoted earlier. But even that, of course, is a daunting task. I have to confess that as a church, we've never really been able to do justice to in-depth dialogue with the great religions of the East. That is due partially to the time we spent with our Abrahamic siblings, Jews and Muslims, and part of it just due to our lack of staff and expertise and resources. Fortunately, somewhere along the way during those 9 years I spent in New York City, I was blessed to run across the Reverend Dr. Gwen Gibbord. Gwen was a force of nature. She was newly ordained in her 50s, an attractive woman with an iron gray helmet of hair and invariably dressed in a gorgeous suit with a black clergy vest and clerical collar. We both served on the church's standing commission on ecumenical relations, but I soon learned that Gwen's first love was interfaith. She served as really, I think, an unpaid staff officer in the Diocese of Los Angeles, and soon became a liaison to my staff in New York City. From her, I think I learned three things. First of all, it's probably preferable to refer to interreligious relations rather than interfaith, since faith is not really a category in some of the world's religions. Secondly, interreligious dialogue is probably best done ecumenically, that is, in partnership with other Christians, because it's not Episcopal Jewish dialogue, it's Christian Jewish dialogue. So better to do it ecumenically. And then thirdly, because of the complexity and the multifaceted nature of these world religions, it's likely best to do dialogue not on a national level at all, but rather locally, where one can engage a specific community. That's especially true, I think, of Hinduism and Buddhism. So Gwen became a kind of West Coast office as she coordinated dialogues in Southern California with the Buddhist, Hindu, and Muslim and Sikh communities. It was her dream to establish a center for interreligious dialogue. And she was able to get that done before she lost her 10-year battle with cancer in 2019. I miss her still. I don't know where Gwen got her money, but she had a ton of it. We were once hosted with a lavish meal in a palatial home she shared with her wife, Dr. Lois Sprague, who was the well-known psychiatrist. So between their resources and some seed money from the Episcopal Church and the Diocese of Los Angeles, and many generous grants from friends and supporters, such a center was begun. It was renamed the Gibbord Center in her honor after her death, and they continue to do amazing work today. Well, sorry for the long introduction, but I think the context of this work is important. To get specifically to Hinduism, I'd just like to share a couple of things that we learned in an amazing conference at the Gibbord Center in 2015. And then after I kind of run through that, I'll turn it over to Gary for some more detailed overview of Hinduism itself. This conference was called, and again, this is an example of the kind of things that we were able to do and take place all around the country, often unrecognized, I'm afraid. But this particular one was called Decoding Rituals and Symbols of Hinduism, which of course is a very rich and important thing. Just a one-day conference. There was a morning session, a luncheon, ritual worship in the temple, discussion and explanation, and a Q&A time. It was led by Swami Sarva Devananda of the Vedanta Society of Southern California. So this is really, these principles that I'll be sharing come from the Vedantic expression of of Hinduism. So again, just some things that I picked up that I thought were important to flag and to remember as we enter into any kind of interfaith dialogue, really, but this specifically to the Hindu. He said, and his understanding is religion is the realization of one truth eternal. That which is one. Sages call it by various names, he said, God or Allah, Bodhisattva, Nirvana, Brahman, Atman. Each religion, he believes, is a valid path to the one truth eternal. And I think that is probably a feature of Hinduism across the board. He said each religion, of course, has produced saints and seers who are really worshipped and or recognized, at least, all around the world. In every great religion, he said, there are three parts. And I think this was particularly important and a kind of frame that I try to take into all of these religions. The three parts are philosophy, mythology, and ritual. Philosophy is the essence of each religion. It presents the whole scope of the religion, setting forth kind of basic principles. Mythology is philosophy made concrete, and the abstractions of philosophy are concretized in the lives of men and women and supernatural beings. And finally, ritual is even more concrete. It's made up of forms and ceremonies and various physical attitudes and flowers and incense, particularly rich in Hinduism. And he said, abstract ideas are hard to comprehend. Therefore, symbols are of great help. We cannot really dispense with the symbolic nature of religion, he said. We can't think but in symbols. Words are symbols of thought. There never was an idea without a corresponding word. So to represent ideas, Hindus use sound and symbols or various form symbols. And he said, according to the temperament and nature of a person, one is free to choose an appropriate symbol: mother, father, Shiva, or Durga. Hindu religion involves in a whole wide range of symbols and rituals, as we'll hear about in a few minutes. He said, ultimate truth is one without a second, beyond time and space and causation. In Hinduism, there's tremendous scope and choice as we try to approach that ultimate truth. There are sound symbols like Om, used in meditation, which we are all familiar with, at least in a caricature way. There are form symbols, various gods and goddesses. There are superhuman personalities, avatars. There are holy personalities, saints, and sages that are looked up to. And there's the natural world, which they are unafraid to embrace: sun and moon and ocean and mountain, plants, trees. Nature is worshipped, but not as the physical matter, but as spirituality or spiritual essence of each thing. And finally, he said that divinity is really everywhere, but we don't perceive it due to our ignorance. He said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God, quoting Jesus. It's important to attain purity of heart in order to be able to perceive this ultimate truth. And that's where Hindu ritual and worship comes in. There are 6 parts to the worship of images, which we sometimes don't realize. There's preparation, there's a purification process for the individual. There's an experience of divinization, invocation, and service to the deity. And then finally, a conclusion. Preparation is when you are kind of getting ready for worship, gathering things for the offerings, plucking flowers, that kind of thing. External purification might involve bathing or washing, setting up the place of worship, purifying the ground and removing various obstacles to worship. Internal purification is what we might think of as meditation, regulating the breath, paying attention to breathing and posture, but destroying negative thoughts and focuses by various kinds of imagery. Divinization is that moment when one can affirm one's unity with the divine, when you sense that you are really one with the holy. And we invoke the divine within the heart, sort of like we do when we play an invocation prayer. We invoke the Holy Spirit into our lives. And then finally, service to the deity. It might be offering water to wash the feet of the worshipers, or rinsing the mouth and hands, perfume, flowers, sacred leaves, incense, light, all kinds of food offering, elaborate worship in this religion, even the offering of clothing and ornaments and flower gardens. Then at the conclusion, there is simply a prayer offering the fruits of that time of meditation and prayer, offering the whole experience to God, and moving forth into your day, and moving forth into the rest of your life. Well, I just thought those were lovely thoughts shared by the Swami, and the kind of things that perhaps we can use in our study of other religions as we move through this class. So Gary, maybe you'd like to share with us now an overview, and then we can engage in some conversation together. Tell us how you got into this stuff too.
So a lot of you have heard these stories about me, and I'm just going to go quickly over them. But I really started being interested in other religions when I went to Northwest Christian College. That's what NCC stands for. It's now called Bushnell University. It's gone through 2 name changes in the since I've been there. But I remember, and like I said, I mentioned this before, going into the library and falling in love with the Encyclopedia Judaica, and this huge, wonderful collection of books, and I lived in that thing for a long time. And some friends and I started going every so often to the local conservative Jewish synagogue, and were welcomed by that rabbi and that congregation. At the same time, I started, because the University of Oregon was right across the street from NCC, I started a degree there in religious studies, where I wasn't just studying Christian tradition, but it was all the religions. And so I took a class in Hinduism, and I took class in all the world's religions and all of those kinds of things. And it really opened my eyes and my heart to understand what was going on as religions sort of developed and got to interact with one another, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not so much. But as sort of interreligious and ecumenical work really came to the fore when, in all of my years in campus ministry, where I was a part of a body at each campus at Duke and the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, and UC Berkeley, that was made up of the campus ministers for lots of various traditions. And depending on the school where we were, you might have greater representation, and other schools had less representation, primarily based on the demographics, of course, of the student body. But I remember having a really wonderful discussion with the rabbi when I was at Duke, and him giving us a Bible study on Jacob's dream and putting his head on the stone. And I mean, a fabulous Bible study coming from somebody who wasn't us, the Christian side. And I remember discussions with mostly Christians in these various religious councils, saying, we need a Buddhist. And I would look around the room and see 7 Christians of varying kinds, and they would say, we need a Buddhist. And Tibetan? Zen? Are we talking Vietnamese? What about Korean? And they would sort of, oh, I guess so. and this breadth of understanding that there was more going on out there. And then when I came to Denver in 2007 to become the university chaplain, then I was responsible for the entire religious life of the university, not just Episcopalians. And so it became part of my job to make sure that if there were Buddhists, I had somebody who was able to speak their language. I was a huge champion for the Mormons at DU. The Jewish rabbi there said that, it was because of what I was doing that it helped them do their job better. I wanted the campus to be a place where that kind of religious diversity was embraced, and we could see it despite what was going on in the newspapers. We could see how religions could cooperate and work together for the good of a community, in that case, the community at DU. And so I was able to go to some wonderful conferences. And the picture on the left there is me at the Parliament of the World's Religions that was held in Salt Lake City. And this was probably back in 2015, I think. I forget exactly what date. Do you remember, Bishop?
I really don't.
Anyway, and so the American Sikh Council, that you can see 3 Sikhs there, what they were doing is they would give anybody who walked by a turban. And and many of you know that I really, really love to wear hats. And this was an opportunity for me to get a hat put on by somebody else that I could never figure out how to tie again. And I wore that throughout the rest of the day as I wandered around. And that was just great fun. And I have such great respect for the Sikhs. I learned such great respect for all of these other religions. It was just so much fun to be in that place. And it's wonderful to know that the next Parliament of the World's Religions will be happening in Chicago in the fall of 2023. And I will be there. I'm going to go and see if I, and also my bishop in California, and Bishop Epting knows him well, Bishop Bill Swing, was the founder of an organization called, I just lost them.
United Religions Initiative, URI.
United Religions Initiative, one of those moments. And he taught me so much about how you can be a Christian in these gatherings of other religions without watering down who you were. And that gained a lot of respect among others because you didn't expect them to water down who they were in your conversations with them. So this has been a professional and personal interest for me for 45 years now, 35, 45 years. And it's so much fun to be able to engage in this conversation. So just real quickly, I'd like you to read this quote here from Ramakrishna, a Hindu scholar, thinker of the last centuries. So many religions, so many paths to reach the one and same goal. And think about that for a moment. And then if you want, and you're muted, unmute yourself and jump in. If you're not muted, just jump in. And what's wrong with this picture and what's right with this picture? Anyone?
Well, I think what's right with it is that we Christians are told, as you pointed out yesterday, there are many rooms. And we tend to think that there's only one, and it's ours, and we're the only ones that are right. And I'm sure other religions have that problem too, because of, I don't know, I guess the desire to be right or to be the best or whatever. But I think that this shows the fact that there are many paths to God, and that, or the divine being, whatever word you want to use. And we need to respect those paths. A book that the Monday Book Club read was The Book of Joy by the Dalai Lama and Bishop Tutu. And oh, the fun they had, the joy that came through that book between the two of them. And one of the scenes I loved, it was after they had shared their Reverend Tutu, the Eucharist ceremony, and the Dalai Lama, it was meditation. It was meditation to a point where all sense of self was lost. And something came up about the people who don't believe are going to go to hell. And the Dalai Lama said, "Oh, well, I'll be there to take them up." And I just love that line. I love it. And I want us all to realize that truth, you know.
Thank you, Irma. Someone else?
Well, I think what might be wrong with this picture is I'm not sure that all the religions have one and the same goal. So that's just my 2 cents on Hinduism. We had a presentation by Hindu at Good Shepherd a few years ago, and he talked about various gods. And so, can you comment on that?
We'll get there. Thanks. Sure. Anyone else? I heard another voice starting up.
I think what's wrong with this picture is that human beings want so much to have their religion be right. In fact, they want to control the people in their religion, and they want more people to control. And that's where the religions feel like they can't cooperate, or I think, at the base of all of the non-cooperation. And what's right with this picture is, I believe it's quite true that we're all on the same path. We're not on different paths, but we're all heading for a loving relationship with our divinity, and a loving relationship with one another. And that's what the paths should lead to. So I'm also a little worried that this looks like Mount Sinai behind it. Anyway, should be another mountain.
I claim no photos. This is why I love Google Images.
Well, I think it's
before we go
I
on.
think it is just great that out of this group has come both what's right and what's wrong. I mean, I think that's fantastic. I certainly fall into the camp, as I've told Gary, of one who thinks that the old image of the mountain with the different base, it's very different around the bases. You can hardly recognize that it's the same mountain. You might have forest or desert or rocks, and it might be a smooth path and a difficult path. You get up a little higher and you get on the tree line, and you can hear one another's voices around the mountain. And when you get to the top, you find you're in the same place. But that can be done really simplistically, like we all are gonna, we all have the same goal, and we don't. Certainly in the short term, the goals of these religions are quite different. I think we're going to see that as we move through it. So, it like many things in life, for me at least, it's a both and. But that's just my 2 cents worth.
Good Anglican word there. And both and. So I'm going to move in just a second. But one of the images that we often hear is that there are many paths up the mountain to God. And as someone at one point pointed out to me, no, we've got it reversed. Is that God uses many paths to get to us. And I've always sort of liked that image as well. So I've become a fan in many respects of a scholar at Boston University by the name of Stephen Prothero, who a number of years ago wrote a book called God is Not One. This is, I guess, the second edition because the cover is different than mine. The 8 rival religions that run the world and why their differences matter. And so this gets a little bit at what Whit was saying, or some of the others of you were saying, is that we are different. And he uses this schema, and whether it's correct or not, I think it's helpful. He uses this schema that there are 4 things that he addresses, and we'll hear this in just a minute. He says that there is a problem that each religion identifies, and then there's a solution to that problem, or a goal, and that there are techniques for moving from the problem to the solution. And then there are exemplars who chart the path from the problem to the solution. So if you, because Christianity, we'll talk about Christianity way at the end, and I can use this one and you'll all sort of understand. There's a problem, it's called sin. There's a solution, it's called salvation. And there are techniques, they're called repentance and faith and good works, and all of those kinds of things are various techniques that move us out of sin to salvation. And there are exemplars, they're called saints, right? So that's a real brief overview of how Christianity would answer these four bullet points here: problem, solution, techniques, and exemplars. We may not use this schema for each one of the world's religions, but I'm going to play now about a 13-minute interview with Stephen Prothero on Hinduism, and you'll see how he works through this. And it's unfortunately it's an audio interview. There are visuals, but they're kind of static, so it's not watching him talk. This was a podcast. And the woman who is interviewing him, Sister Maureen Fiedler, she was a sister of Loreto, and founded a podcast called Interfaith Voices that's still going on, although it has a different host right now. But so this is Maureen Fiedler interviewing Stephen Prothero on Hinduism.
What Hinduism identifies as the major problem of humanity and its solution.
Well, the problem is that we keep being reborn. So in Hinduism develops this idea of samsara, and what samsara means is wandering through or flowing through. And what you're wandering and flowing through is multiple lifetimes. So we're born, we live, we suffer, we die, and we're reborn. And that's seen to be not an opportunity like it is for many who believe in reincarnation in the West, but as a difficulty, as the problem. And we want to get out of that, and we get out of that through moksha, which is spiritual liberation, recognizing the unity of the human self with the divine reality through some manner or method, and that sort of pops us out of this cycle of life, death, and rebirth.
And you say that Hinduism, of all the major faiths that you study, is the least dogmatic and the most diverse internally.
That's right, because Hindus have had a strategy of meeting with other religions, and they've met with so many of them over the years by basically accommodating and including them. So instead of saying, no, we have the one true God, your God is false, they say yes, and they bring them in. And so Hinduism over time just becomes, rather than getting sort of more defined over against its enemies, it becomes more and more inclusive of them. So as the Buddhists arrive, then the Hindus say, oh, well, Buddha, he's a incarnation of Vishnu, our god Vishnu. Or, oh, here comes Jesus. Oh, he's an incarnation of Vishnu also. And there isn't a pope, there isn't a creed, there isn't a sort of centralized structure that's able to define orthodoxy, nor is there much interest in defining orthodoxy. And so it's just this real big tent of a religion, Hinduism.
Now, let's talk for a minute about the origins of Hinduism. When can you date it from? And I believe it emerged in the Indus Valley of India.
Yeah, it goes back really far. I mean, it's one of our most ancient religions. We have this sort of proto-Hinduism or of a pre-Hinduism that's called Indus Valley civilization that maybe goes back to something like 2500 to 1500 BCE, before Jesus. And here we have sort of hints of the possibilities of Hinduism. We don't have a sense of the idea of samsara and moksha that I just described, but we have some female goddesses that may have been worshipped. We have some images of possibly divinities doing something that's like yoga. We have animals that seem to be sacrificed. We have ritual bathing. We have some building blocks of Hinduism, basically.
And there's no, one person you can name as a founder of Hinduism. Like you could talk about Confucius or Jesus or Mohammed or something.
That's right. It just sort of recedes back into ancienter and ancienter history. We don't have a founder.
Part of the title of this period, though, is Bhakti Yoga. And a lot of us connect yoga with Hinduism. And of course, a lot of people today use yoga for everything under the sun that doesn't have anything to do with religion. They do it for well-being, to lose weight, for whatever. What's the connection of yoga to Hinduism?
Well, yoga is a discipline. So the classic goal for yoga in ancient Hinduism, and it is a Hindu practice, would be to achieve that union of self and God. So it's related to the word yoke. So you yoke the self to God. in order to achieve moksha, in order to achieve spiritual liberation, to realize the deathless, eternal part of yourself and to yoke it to the deathless, eternal reality out there, which is Brahman.
Mm. Now, in terms of religious texts, there are the Vedas, the Upanishads, but the one that's considered the most important, I believe, in Hinduism is the Bhagavad Gita, which is, you say, a dialogue on the ethics of war. Can you talk about that book?
Yeah, so what happens, which to me is fascinating in the development of Hinduism, is you move from scriptures in the Vedas, which are ritual manuals, to scriptures with the Upanishads, which are philosophical texts, to stories, to epics. And the tradition really now becomes more of a narrative and storytelling tradition. And these are massive stories, like in the Mahabharata, which is the broader text that the Bhagavad Gita is a teeny piece of. You know, these are many, many times over the length of the Bible. And in the Bhagavad Gita, what you have is a war between two families, and you have this person, Arjuna, who's in the Pandava family, and he's about to go to war, and it's his duty, according to the caste ethics of Hinduism, as a warrior to fight. But he realizes that as he goes to war, he's going to be fighting with his kinsmen, with his cousins, and he's going to have to kill them, and that's not good, you know. So he's sort of caught between two duties. And he gets in basically a philosophical discussion with his charioteer, who turns out to be Krishna. This is a lovely thing about Hindu epics, is that you never really know who's who, you know. People can sort of shapeshift and take different forms, and it's fascinating. So anyway, and the argument becomes, you know, fight and do the war, says the charioteer, who is Krishna, but don't be attached to the fruits of your actions. In other words, give them up to God. And it develops in this text a new way of being a Hindu, where you can get to the goal of moksha through a kind of renunciation of philosophical Hinduism, but you can also get there by loving God, and you can also get there by action in the world. And so it opens up the Hindu religious goal to all kinds of people, including warriors, including everyday housewives and husbands.
Now, is Hinduism linked at all to the caste system in India?
Oh my gosh, I get in so much trouble about this. I had a little fight in D.C. the other day with a Hindu about this. Yes, the answer is yes. I mean, you know, a lot of contemporary Hindus want to say, you know, make this sort of culture, social, religious distinction and say, well, that's a cultural thing. It has nothing to do with Hinduism. And of course,
I've had Hindus say that to me on this show.
Yeah, and, you know, it was banished, you know, by the British, you know, hundreds of years ago. But it persists. And if you're in India, everybody in India knows the caste of everybody else. I mean, it's quite astonishing. So yes, caste is part of Hinduism. It's something that Hindus in the West are embarrassed about. It's something that intellectuals try to banish, but it has traditionally been a part of the religion, and it persists against the better judgment of many Hindus. It's something that's still there in the culture today.
And I think it would be fair to say the majority of Hindus do want to get rid of it.
Well, they want to get rid of it, but they don't want their kids to marry outside of their caste.
Oh, okay.
So,
that's
I mean,
the tradition in India.
Well, it's the tradition in America, too. I mean, my students at Boston University are pretty much marrying inside their caste.
Now, the gods of Hinduism. There are many, and they're colorful. In fact, this is probably the most colorful of all the religions that you describe. You know, you have Ganesha, who has the head of an elephant. You have the woman who's dancing with, I forget, 8 arms, I think it is. Who are these gods? Describe that pantheon, if you will, in Hinduism.
Right. Let me say quickly that there are many Hindus, both in America and in India, who say there's only one God in Hinduism. So there's a fascinating debate about whether Hinduism is monotheistic or polytheistic. On the surface, it certainly seems to be polytheistic, because you have all these gods, and they talk to each other, they fight with each other, they tease and trick each other. They have these fabulous epics written about them. And on that level of multiple gods, there's often said to be a trinity, where there's Brahma, the creator, Vishnu, the sustainer, and Shiva, the destroyer. So when the world needs to be created, that's Brahma's job. When the world needs to be sustained, that's Vishnu's job. When the world needs to be destroyed, that's Shiva's job. And remember this problem, this master metaphor in Hinduism of samsara, the wandering, flowing through cycle of life, death, and rebirth. That applies to human life, but also applies to the cosmos. So the world we're living in now was created at one point, but before that it was created, another cosmos was destroyed and previously created, etc. But Brahma really isn't much worshipped in India, so you're not going to find a lot of Brahma temples. Brahma is a little bit like the high god actually in the Yoruba tradition, but also the god of deism that sort of makes the world but doesn't really have much of a job. So the real trinity, I think, is really Vishnu and Shiva and then the Mahadevi, the great goddess, which is interesting that there are female divinities in Hinduism that are very important, and this is one feature of Hinduism that's very attractive to feminists.
Now, there is also a fascinating set of prayers and rituals in Hinduism. And I know that I visited an ashram that was founded by a Hindu, and I was at the puja, which is I think their central ritual. And it certainly flourishes in symbolism. I can remember, since I'm a Roman Catholic myself, I looked and I thought, my goodness, Hindus are the Roman Catholics of the East in the sense of their use of symbols, almost sacramental kinds of signs. Can you talk about the puja or the rituals of Hinduism?
Yeah, that's an interesting comparison. I think there's something to that. I hadn't actually thought about that so much, in the sense that in Catholicism you have sacraments that you have to have stuff for them, right? You have to have bread,
right,
or water or oil. And similarly, stuff is part of Hindu rituals too, right? You have fire, you have rice that's given as an offering. And it's fascinating, it's amazing. If you go to a Hindu temple, they don't have services typically in the same way that you think of, you go to church at 11 in the morning. Temples are just open and you just go by yourself with your family and you bring an offering to the divinity, and then you're given something back. So often you'll bring food, and then you're given back this food that's kind of been made sacred by the god and by the priest. My colleague Diana Eck at Harvard has written this wonderful book about Hindu puja, Hindu ritual, where she argues that what is really the core of the puja is actually sight. In other words, that it's about seeing and being seen. And the word in Hinduism is darshan. Now, that's not like going to a nightclub to see and be seen, because you're not being seen by others, you're being seen by the divinity. And you have this moment of intimate encounter that is that devotion, that is the Hindu way of devotion, as I call it in the book, where you have this kind of love exchange between the two of you.
And you mentioned darshan. There is a hugging saint of Hinduism called Amma, and she goes around literally hugging people, and she's giving darshan. That's what she says. And that's sort of a spreading of love or compassion.
Yeah, that's right. And and she's sort of internationally famous, and I think that epitomizes the way of devotion piece of Hinduism, but it also epitomizes the fact that in Hinduism you have a kind of fluidity between who's a god and who's a human. There really isn't a distinction between the self, the Atman, the essence of the human being, and Brahman, the essence of God. And since that's the case, humans can be gods of a sort, to whom you can go and have darshan, to whom you can devote yourself in a way. And this makes especially Christians in the West really nervous, because it sounds like idolatry, right? You're worshiping, how can you worship another human being? But humans can have that capacity in the Hindu tradition.
All right, and finally, how would you characterize Hinduism's influence in the world at large?
It has largely been confined to India, which is interesting. We have it in Europe, we have it in the United States, we have it in Bali. But I think Hinduism is a wonderful example of how to get along across religious boundaries. I mean, the Hindus have been, because of their sort of standing at a sort of crossroads in the world, and because of their strategy of inclusion, they've been very good at cultivating conversations from ancient times with Buddhists, with Muslims more recently, and then with Christians. And Hindus are very good at this, and I think we can learn from them how to have informed, constructive conversations across religious boundaries without giving up our own religious commitments along the way.
Stephen Prothero is the author of God is Not One.
So now you've seen how the author works this through, and I'm just going to sort of summarize it here. For Hinduism, the problem is samsara, this endless cycle of births and deaths and rebirths, and you want to get out of it. And the solution for that is this moksha, that's getting out of samsara. And how do you do this? He didn't quite spell this out in his interview, but he spells it out in the book, that there are these yogas. He talked about the yogas, the yoking, to sort of be yoked with God. But in the book, and this sort of gets traced out historically in the Vedas, the oldest part of the scriptures, it's karma yoga, action. It's all about the kinds of rituals and things that you do. And then as time went on, he talked about the Upanishads. This is jnana yoga, or you're linked through wisdom. And we hear that with the Upanishads, and some of the others are Radhakrishnan that we started with there is a wisdom. But then it develops into bhakti yoga, which is devotion. And so, the action stuff is really, well, the priests know how to do that. And the wisdom stuff, the really smart people know how to do that and who can think about these things. But what about all the rest of us? The folks who have to get up and go to work, who have to bathe their babies, who have to go shopping. How do the rest of us do it? And this is bhakti yoga. And so the action and the wisdom and the devotion are these techniques that historically have been part of Hinduism. And so who are the exemplars? Well, the sannyasins, or the mystics, or the renouncers. And we have these images in our mind of these holy, these emaciated holy men of India walking around either naked or only in a loincloth, who look like they're 2 steps away from death because they're so thin, painted in all sorts of weird colors. So these are sort of the karma yogi folk in some respects. The jnana yogists are the philosophers, Sri Ramakrishna, or Swami Vivekananda, well-known Hindu who came to Chicago in 1896 to the very first parliament of the world's religions and sort of introduced Hinduism to the Western world. And then another exemplar is a guy named Caitanya, which most people haven't heard of, but he stands behind what is now known as the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, or the Hare Krishnas. The Hare Krishnas are perfect examples of bhakti yoga, singing songs that get you into a trance to devote, so that you're devoted to the God, Krishna, and all of those kinds of things. So this is kind of an overview of how Prothero's schema works its way through in Hinduism. We've got the problem, samsara, the solution, moksha, the techniques, various kinds of yoga, and then various people who are examples of that kind of yoga. So with that introduction to Hinduism, I'm going to just sort of open it up for sort of broad-based discussion. If you were unaware, there is the Hindu Temple and Cultural Center of the Rockies, which is right down by the Arapahoe jail. It's right there at the corner of Potomac and Dove Valley. It's right by the Broncos. But they built this within the last 5 or 6 years. I've been in it. It's a fascinating place. It used to be located over on Wadsworth, and it took them a long time to get their permits and to raise enough money. But if you drive down Potomac, you'll see it up there on the hill on the west side. So I'm opening it up for discussion, questions. We've got about 10 minutes before I'll close this off. So feel free, if you're muted, to unmute yourself. You can ask a question of me, ask a question of the bishop, or both of us, and we'll see what kind of responses we can get.
One of the things that I've found in studying faiths, and we did that for a while, in our church where we went to different religions. And when we did the Hindu faith and what you have just presented, about 70% of that, I would say, oh, well, we do that too. We also do that. We have that. We have that too. So we see this similarity. The one that I saw that impressed me, when at the service, toward the end of it, they brought out the incense and waved it in front. And I went, well, in the Catholic Church, we do that. If you go to the Greek Orthodox Church, they do that throughout the whole service. So I'm figuring the Hindus came through Palestine and the Jews saw that and said, oh, let's put that in our service. And the Catholics said, well, the Jews have it, so let's put it in our service. So I see a lot of faiths where we're as much Hindu as the Hindus are.
Seen on there.
Thanks, Mike.
I have a question. I have a question on Buddhism. So as Christianity was evolved from Judaism, it seems like Buddhism has evolved from Hinduism. And is that something that we'll discuss later on? Is Buddhism as a separate faith, or do you want to talk about it now?
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, exactly. So I should have said this at the beginning. Our thought is we've only got 5 weeks, and we can't even talk about the 8 rival religions of the world and why their differences matter. So we're going to focus on sort of the big 4 or big 5. And so today we started with Hinduism as sort of the oldest, and we'll move to Buddhism next week. Not because it's necessarily the next oldest. I think probably Judaism would jump in there, but because as the bishop and I were talking about this, our interactions as Episcopalians with Hindus and Buddhists have been sort of lesser than they have been with Jews and Muslims. So we're going to start here with Hinduism. Next week, we'll talk about Buddhism. Then we'll talk about Judaism, and then Hinduism. And then the last week, we'll talk about how we as Episcopalians talk with other Christians. Does that help, Mark? We'll
Yes,
get to
yeah,
Judaism.
thanks. Yeah.
Perfect.
I want to go back to something that Bishop Chris mentioned earlier in his introduction, and that is, in order to create understanding, cooperation, and yes, love between the religions, we have to talk. And this is about Hinduism today, which is great, but they're nice guys. And we as Christians think we're nice guys. And aside from the Crusades and some of that stuff we don't want to talk about.
Right.
But I hope we will get to the point where there's problems talking to other religions, and they have problems talking to Christians because of this one-way thing. And so, and we want to seek understanding. We say we want to seek understanding, but let's face it, there's Christians that, believe in the only one true faith. And so I don't see how we ever get there.
Bishop, you want to take that one?
Oh, sure. Well, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's because they're also multifaceted and complex too. We have this difficulty. Where do you start, and with whom do you start? It's certainly true that Hinduism has this sense of inclusion in welcoming and all of that. We think of them as the good guys, but there's a sect today that are quite militant and fight Muslims in India. It's been awful. And we have our dark side, we've got our exclusionary understandings where some people are okay and some people aren't. And we've embraced slavery and homophobia and all the rest of it in our past. And hopefully we're sort of evolving in some ways, and maybe they are too. But you're right, it is a difficult thing. And that's what I found as a national interfaith officer. Where do you start, and with whom do you speak, and how do you set these kind of things up? And we did very little in the way of national dialogues. With Islam, it's different. With Judaism, it's somewhat different because they have national organizations that bring together their various divisions, just like our National Council of Churches and World Council of Churches brings together into one body the various Christian communions. But it's a problem, and we can't always look at the bright side. We have to look at the fact that there's a dark side to all of us.
Yeah, and I would just sort of pick up on that to say that goes back to the thing that I mentioned earlier is, all these Christians sitting in the room and saying, we need a Buddhist.
Yeah.
And it doesn't make sense when we think that there are so many of us. How many Christian denominations are there? Well, and how many Buddhist groups are there? Well, so which ones do you want in the room? And so you're absolutely right, Whit. And what I found, at least in my work on various college campuses, is that sometimes we would get together and talk about our similarities and differences, but we found it most helpful when we got together and started talking about, well, what do we want to solve on this campus? What's the issue that we want to address? Is it loneliness? Is it alcoholism? Is it something else? And what tools do we bring to the fore on those kinds of things? Because everybody is going to bring a different set of tools. So, but thank you. It's a very good question. Someone else.
Is the question I have is had a lot of work with a lot of guys who are Indian and the dietary thing, not eating meat, not eating cow, worshiping cows. Is it that they're afraid they're eating their uncle because of reincarnation, or what's the deal there?
Could be. Well, there is, and I don't know, Bishop, you wanted to jump in on this, but there is this reverence for life. And so, it's for some Hindus and some Buddhists that extends to all things, all sentient beings. You'll hear that among many Buddhists, sentient beings. That becomes problematic for some extreme folks from the Eastern religions, the Jains, who would say, well, there's almost everything is sentient. And so we can't consume any of it, and it's best for us to just go ahead and die rather than do that. So the sacred cow piece is an interesting one. I don't know, Bishop, do you have something to add?
I really don't, and I'm not sure. Maybe Gary, reincarnation into lower forms of animal life and all that, I'm not sure is as common. I think we sort of go up and down in the caste system more than we become monkeys or cows. But
yeah, I'm not absolutely positive about that either. I can look it up, find out.
But I think it is more just a sense of vegetarianism. It's a sense of not wanting to eat, as you say, the sentient forms of life, even though a carrot may be sentient too.
The other part of the cow thing is that they produce the milk, the butter that becomes ghee for the worship. So right. That's part of why you don't hurt a cow.
Thank you, Mary. Anyone else?
Well, this is sort of on the last question. The Monday Book Club just finished a nonfiction called Fuzz by Mary Roach. And she is talking about animals that come in contact with human beings. One of those animals are elephants. And obviously in countries where killing an elephant is not acceptable, and folks getting drunk on a mash that they make, and the elephants like it too. And one guy got too close to the elephant, and the land was slippery, and it had a hill to it, and he fell down, and the elephant landed on top of him. Well, of course, he was dead. The other part, other stories so are told about these man-eating leopards in Bengal, and they live in an area that Hindus walk on pilgrimage, and the Hindus now have learned how to build hotels along this walk so people don't have to sleep out in the open. But it's interesting because the desire is not to kill the leopards unless absolutely have to. And the main thing is for human beings to give them their space and let them, hopefully they'll learn to turn on other people. But as the author says, we're meat. We're meat. And we probably taste pretty good. So why not?
Right. So the
And
question is,
he has a good sense of humor. But I just thought, they've learned how to live with pretty bad animals.
so I'm going to end here with and say thank you to everybody. I taught a class when I was at DU. Maybe I should do it again for y'all, but it was called Pets, Partners, or Pot Roast. How do we deal with our non-human neighbors? And one of the things that we start out with is what distinguishes us from our non-human neighbors. And the more you go into that, you find that there is less and less and less that really distinguishes us. And so it raises all sorts of questions about whether or not you can do research on them, whether it's biomedical research or cosmetic research, whether you can eat them, whether you can keep them as a pet, all of these kinds of things. How do you deal with all of these our non-human neighbors? And I think that what we've heard here this morning sort of raises that question in its own little way. So thank you all. This has been great. There were 30 some people on this call, and that's amazing. So I'm really happy to see everybody there. Look forward to seeing you next week. If you have any questions or any suggestions or anything like that, let me know. But next week we'll talk about Buddhism. We'll have more time to talk about Buddhism because we won't be doing all of this introductory stuff that we spent doing this time. But it'll be good. We can pick up some themes maybe from this week and keep going. But in the meantime, everybody have a good week, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you, Bishop.
Thank you,
Okay,
Father and
thank
Bishop,
you
for their
both.
work. It's greatly done. Greatly
Thank you.
appreciated.